This is a conversation between Matthew Roszak, we heard from Matthew yesterday, and Brian Forde. Now, these are two people that really get it, okay? And you'll see what I mean. So, for example, Matthew, we heard from him yesterday. He's an investor in the space. He is the chairman and founder of Bloq, building the tools of this industry. And in his spare time, he's chairman of this Chamber of Commerce initiative, where they feed in their own time, policy papers for government. Okay, so that was a terrific side. And then the other side of it, Brian Forde, so he was the senior advisor for the White House in the Obama administration for science and tech before leading MIT's digital currency initiative. When he's running for office, the press call him the crypto candidate. And I love that. Because of these two gentlemen, I think that there's hope for the USA in the token economy. With a bit of luck, might even remain a democracy. Gentlemen, please come onto the stage.
All right, well, good morning. Regulation at 9 a.m. Is a tough slot, but there's plenty of coffee, and we've got a great conversation. So, well, let's kick it off here. Brian, you wrote the memo for Bitcoin at the White House.
I did.
What was that like? What was the time scale, and what happened after that?
Yeah, so this is back in 2014. I was a senior tech advisor in the Obama White House. And, part of our role and part of what you have when you have a president who's deeply interested in science and technology is that you get inquiries about learning about it, learning about all of the latest emerging technologies. Clearly, back in 2013, 2014, Bitcoin was something that we should all just learn more about. And, when you're looking at cryptocurrencies in government, the first things, or when you look at just emerging technologies in general, the first thing that people start to zoom in on are the negative impacts of that emerging technology. But when you actually have technologists in the room, not just policymakers, they can actually clearly demonstrate to senior policymakers, including the President of the United States, all of the benefits as well, and show historically how emerging technologies have been used for both good and bad, but in the net of it, is generally positively impact society. So it was really important to be able to, get together a White House memo on Bitcoin and then talk to the president about it, someone who's been, historically deeply curious about science and technology and being on the right side of history for that technology. And now we see around the world heads of state really dig into crypto, and I think extra officially, I would argue that that Matt is one of the best ambassadors of Bitcoin. I've seen him give Bitcoins to many heads of state, including Bill Clinton and others. And so it really is important for all of you to use, any connections that you have to sit down and have those proper conversations with people in government, because a lot of the information that they're getting about cryptocurrencies is negative.
Yeah, no, and you see that because just how we're wired. Whether it's us, our brothers, sisters, neighbors, even members of Congress, you think back to the last 10 headlines of Bitcoin, whether that's historically or even in the near term, you still remember the hacks, the Mt. Goxes, et cetera, and that kind of stays resident in their brains. And so engaging with regulators is always a good thing. As was mentioned earlier, I proudly serve as chairman of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. This is the largest trade association representing this ecosystem in Washington, D.C. and beyond. So it's a global organization, over 300 members. So everybody from CME, NASDAQ, IBM, Microsoft, et cetera, to some of the most prolific startups in the space. And it's... on one hand, there's a big regulatory advocacy dynamic. On the other hand, it's an amazing network of entrepreneurs and technologists and builders in this space. And as I mentioned yesterday, it's when I go into these meetings with these members of Congress or heads of state, I tell them that I really. I'm challenged by going in there because I want to be building and investing and hiring. I care very deeply about this space, and so if you do so, you need to engage, you need to educate, and that's been, a big part of the process to have blockchain education days and engaging on the Hill, testifying with some of these committees. And what's interesting is the timeline of and the cadence of hearings and discussions has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. So you see this demand that they're like, hey, teach us, feed us, help us understand how to balance this, because from our standpoint, we think this will light up every single light in DC, in Beijing, and everywhere around the world. So super important to do that. Another dynamic is having this community, which 5 years ago was a couple billion in market cap, and today is a couple $100 billion in market cap. And so as this industry builds, we have more resources, right? And so what is a way where you can sponsor, support, and fund a member of Congress and show them that this is a new blood vessel of value, a new money system, and be able to accept that. The Federal Election Commission had certain ways in which members of Congress could absorb crypto, and that's not necessarily well understood. But what's been your experience? Because you've raised a lot of money for your campaign with crypto. Right. So what's some advice? How do you unpack that discussion for DC?
Sure. So, let's just start with the basics. That'll maybe it won't surprise you, but less than 4% of people in Congress have a technical background. That should be readily apparent to you, especially if you watch the Zuckerberg congressional hearing, where you guys are laughing because it was pretty funny, but it's also our future. And, it's really sad to see also the average age of our members of Congress. On the congressional side, I think it's Democratic leadership, it's like north of 70. So these people do not understand emerging technologies, and it's incredibly important for them to understand it and to use it. And I think that's the best way that you're going to be able to understand it. I think some of the problems that we saw in the congressional hearing with Mark Zuckerberg was that it was clear to everyone in the room that many of the members of Congress and senators that were asking questions had never used Facebook. We're talking 2018, we're talking Facebook. This is 2018, and this is a room full of people talking about cryptocurrency that, many of these are requiring understanding of cryptography, proof of stake, proof of work, and all kinds of, complicated, math behind this. And so we're at a real challenge right here if in the US it wants to maintain its leadership. And so one of the things that we did to break ground with our campaign for Congress was to accept cryptocurrency. In fact, Matt was one of the first donors to make a contribution in cryptocurrency to our campaign. And, it turned out that we ended up raising north of 300 just in our campaign alone. I know outside supporters brought in more money. And so it was interesting to see, because all of a sudden members of Congress started reaching out to me and saying, well, hey, let me know a little bit more about this Bitcoin thing. Hey, let me know a little bit more about this Ethereum thing. Because we were receiving contributions in it. And previously no one had done it at the scale that we had received contributions. And I think what's important about that is that if you want members of Congress to understand, we always talk about what's going to be the killer app in the crypto space. Well, killer app with members of Congress are campaign contributions. And, if you're getting them to accept Bitcoin and Ethereum, all of a sudden they'll take the time to learn a little bit more about it. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. Not just for cryptocurrencies. I joke that it's the killer app, but contributions. But I also want them getting in an autonomous vehicle. I also want them riding one of those Bird or Lime scooters. They need to experience emerging technologies, because we're not just in this siloed system where we're the only ones facing regulatory ambiguity, right? Because it's not really challenges. Like, no one's really challenging as much as we're just not a clear set of rules. Most of us are good faith actors that actually just want to follow the rules and do well. And we just need those clear lines drawn, and they're just not drawn. It's not legal, it's not illegal, it's just gray. And that's where all emerging technologies sit. And, all the scooter companies are in just as much of legal gray area as the sharing economy is, and Uber and Lyft and Bitcoin and Ethereum and every other cryptocurrency that we have out there. So I think experiencing it is incredibly important. And if you are American or a green card holder, you should encourage your local representatives to accept crypto as well. It's something that I continually talk to members of Congress about. And, it's exciting in the last financial filings, what we saw is I think at least 3 members of Congress now have cryptocurrency holdings as part of their investment portfolio.
Yeah, and now I remember testifying in front of Congress as a leader. They invited me to come, and I was like, wow, I'm going to testify in front of Congress. I'm like, I'm going to put a tie on. I don't rarely wear ties. Preparing my speech that goes on the congressional record. And it was like one of these really exciting moments. And so I give my spiel, and then the questions were really like basic, and then there was, and like during the middle of it, this old congressman came out of like some mystery door with a cane and kind of came in and sat down, and then he kind of grabbed the mic and he's like, why does the price go up and down so much? And I'm like, price discovery, early days. And then he gets up and walks back to that secret door with his cane and leaves. And that was the whole thing.
Yeah.
So while you want to impress upon them all these awesome changes and stuff, it's a big process, especially with the demographic there. And then there is other dynamics because while we're trying to affect change in money systems and financial services, and people talk about like market structure, this is like industrial organization. Like new networks are getting built. It's like banks. Competitions is not the bank across the street. It is Alibaba and Apple and Amazon, et cetera. And that kind of thinking or those mental models are kind of not as well understood with members of Congress. So again, there's a lot to unpack there. I think as you engage more and try and help them define what this is, we as an industry go there to advocate. The other thing is, the minute we leave, there's other market participants like Amex and Goldman Sachs and PayPal and B of A that go in there with their particular agenda. So I think this is going to get very vibrant in terms of how the compass is set in this space. What do you think about the whippersnapper crypto companies, established financial services companies who've been lobbying and advocating in DC for 100 years now?
Yeah.
How do you see that dynamic playing out?
I think we just got to get really, really simple. In watching Chris, did you guys watch Chris Larson's presentation yesterday? I thought, I've heard this, like people use, it's like, you're putting money into a little container and it just moves or something like that. And like, I just never really understood it. Like, what are you guys talking about? But it wasn't until Chris actually just really used that shipping container. And he said it wasn't actually any company doing this. It was actually just like the shipping container that revolutionized logistics. It wasn't the shipping company. It wasn't the trains. It wasn't the trucks. And I just thought that was just a really good example for being on the right side of history for technology. And that's what we need to, and how that benefits our economy by enabling the ability to ship a shirt from Asia to America for 4 cents. And that's essentially what we're doing for finance, and how that's one of basically a tripod that helps get us to the next economy. And I just don't think, I'm probably the only person who ran for Congress that actually went to a cryptocurrency meetup in my district. And I went there, and there were more than 200 entrepreneurs in the city of Irvine, California, in Southern California, that were there. They each had their startup, and they probably had a combined worth of companies about $500 million. And that is, no one's talking about that. But if you were to be a member of Congress or an elected official and you said, we're bringing in a new company and it's worth $10 million or $50 million, you would, hold a ribbon cutting and it would be the most exciting thing in town. Yet we're sitting on a group of entrepreneurs that probably have $500 million in combined worth for these companies that no one's talking about, that no one's trying to figure out, all right, well, what are some of the blocks that we have? And I think, what we really have to start thinking about, and what I was advocating on the trail and what I continue to advocate for with our members of Congress, is that we get to regulatory sandboxes. We're seeing other governments around the world trying to enable regulatory sandboxes to allow for lawmakers and regulators to learn more about what's happening with these emerging technologies while providing a safe legal space for them to experiment. Because the key here is ensuring consumer safety and consumer rights while at the same time making sure that entrepreneurs have room to grow. And I bring up consumer and safety and consumer rights because sometimes we just talk so much about enabling innovation, but we have to make sure that we also are protecting consumers, because the second there is like mass scale consumer right violation, we're actually in a bad position and we're starting from a really tough position. I'll give you an example with artificial intelligence and just like some of the stuff that's kind of powering and behind it. So in, what example can I use? I'll use an example with, I'll use the government in Michigan hired an outside company, paid about $30-40 million for software. That software was to algorithmically detect if an individual was committing unemployment insurance fraud. And me as a taxpayer, not in the state of Michigan, but just in general, I don't want anyone committing any type of fraud that defrauds the government of the valuable tax dollars that I pay them, that I want used, in important ways. And so they used the software, and sure enough, the software started doing its job. It started to better detect people who were committing unemployment insurance fraud. You saw all of a sudden the amount of people they were catching just went up really quickly. Great, software was doing its job. About 2 years in, they do an audit. And that audit showed that they had north of a 90% error rate. So just to be clear, when you commit unemployment insurance fraud, all of a sudden you could either go to jail or get your wages garnished. So here you are, unemployed. You're really in a tough spot. If you earn anything, you're getting your wages garnished. And you're actually getting your wages garnished and you're in a tough spot, not because you did anything wrong, but because the algorithm did something wrong. Or, the other thing we saw with parole boards is that parole boards were using software to algorithmically detect whether a person has a high likelihood of recommitting a crime. Parole boards use that information to determine whether they should parole someone or not. Turns out, when they finally pried open access to how they came to that evaluation, the algorithms behind it had a systematic bias against black men. Now, when you're looking at either parole boards and being incarcerated, or you're looking at unemployment insurance agency who's garnishing people's wages, those things Google can't do, tech companies can't take your money, tech companies can't put you in jail, but governments can. But everyone uses algorithms to help make these decisions. But what we're finding is that these algorithms are not perfect, and that individuals should have rights that say, hey, what is happening in this algorithm? Is it biased against me? And right now, we don't have that. But for example, if I apply for credit and get denied, I have a right. I have a consumer right to then go to to get my credit score and say, oh, hey, actually this bank got something wrong. I didn't have a late payment here, and get that fixed, go get my credit, right? And so what we're seeing is we have all these emerging technologies, whether it's crypto and wallets, and you got to manage your private keys, and are you FDIC insured, and all this kind of stuff that like we haven't really adapted over to ensure the protection of consumers' rights and safety as well. And so some people think about regulation as bad, but if we get into a situation with our emerging technologies that are adversely impacting the people we're trying to serve, it's actually just going to move us back instead of move us forward. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking about this in a way that that is constructive and the underlying reasoning why we have to come up with these.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Even if they want to engage in and exercise the technology, it could go horribly wrong if not implemented right.
Absolutely.
And so we're at an investor conference, and investors want to know, there's a lack of regulatory clarity on this space. We talked a little bit about this yesterday about, how IRS treats it as property, CFTC treats it as a commodity, and you have all this patchwork of perspectives on this technology, and sometimes it's hard for an investor, and investors inherently want clarity, right? They don't want anything to go wrong or change, the rules change, and in this space, the rules seem to change all the time. So the risk is higher, to say I'm going to make a bet on this, and take a favorite salacious example like Ethereum might turn into a security, right? The stuff you read out there, I don't think it is, So investors have all this kind of research to do to pick a particular space and not say, oop, the regulations changed on me and now it's not worth as much, or right. It pancakes that particular crypto or the ecosystem. Which makes entrepreneurs, which makes investors kind of go elsewhere, right? Yep. The regulatory arbitrage thing is... Yep. Everybody talks about it, and there's do you like Swiss chocolate or do you like durian? Do you going to go to Switzerland or Singapore? That's kind of like the first question you would ask an entrepreneur. It's like, where should I domicile? And then you see stuff happening in the Caribbean. You see a gentleman yesterday talking about Gibraltar or Malta. Liechtenstein is getting its game on. So lots of opportunity to do that. How do you think that's going to play out when the U.S. looks at not like this is the funny thing, like, oh, this is going to be the new Silicon Valley, the new Wall Street, et cetera. And the problem governments will have is that trillion-dollar networks can be built elsewhere because of this poor regulation. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. These aren't like, oh, I'm selling pet food online, and so it's unclear. So how do you think that's going to translate, and how do you actually reel that back in?
I think there's too much complacency in America by our regulators and our legislative and our elected leaders as it relates to technology. We're sitting on our laurels because we thought we were successful with the internet, but we're not seeing the next big internet come, and we're not taking advantage of it. And elected leaders around the world are not stupid. They're incredibly smart when it comes to regulation. What you're seeing right now is regulatory arbitrage. You're not just seeing it around the world, you're also seeing it within the United States as well, as you see different states set up different regulatory schemes that are competing. I was talking to one gubernatorial candidate, and he was saying, wait, Wyoming is ahead of us? And I said, yeah. And you got to kind of go to their pride. And I think, at the federal level, it's going to be challenging, but I think the state level actually might be more promising. When you talk to a policymaker, policymakers actually think about cities and states as laboratories for policy at the federal level. Mm-hmm. And so while it's important to engage at the federal level, especially for the oversight that they have, I wouldn't dismiss state and local as well, because they're actually coming up with some of the most innovative regulation. And I just hope that you guys continue to press upon your elected leaders, because if you're not hosting a roundtable for them, it's part of your responsibility too. You chose to join this industry. No one forced you to join this industry. You chose to get into an industry that is in a regulatory gray space. It is your choice to then engage with government to start to figure this out. And you may not want to do that. That's not what you thought you signed up for, but you did inadvertently sign up for it when you walked into an industry that is in a regulatory gray area. And it's not sexy, it's not fun. Matt talks about how it's the last thing that he wants to do, but he's made a considered effort to do it, to take time away from his investments, because the US right now is not where it's at. But because local entrepreneurs in other countries have been effective at doing it, other countries have been better than us.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a great point on the state stuff where it's not of great consequence for DC or Beijing, for that matter, to see Wyoming doing something. I think Wyoming is doing something that's off the charts innovative.
Right.
And it's kind of like think about other state regulated stuff like cannabis or anything else. The federal level still, is not acknowledging that, but it's all kind of a puzzle pieces that'll help enable that discussion. Because it's like whether it's cannabis or crypto, the banks there still don't have federal clarity, so they don't bank anybody. Right. So while you have these awesome thought leaders in Illinois or Wyoming and New Hampshire's got some stuff going on, Florida, it still is devoid of banking and some of the other key components.